The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now with Ari Melber in for Rachel. Good evening, Ari.
Good evening, and thank you, Chris. And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Rachel has the night off. We begin tonight with one of the more telling admissions from Trump's criminal defense team. One of those nights where you wonder who Rudy Giuliani is really trying to help. Now, one way to understand this absurdity is with the absurd camera work that blessed the internet this weekend when this dog got a hold of a GoPro camera. The video perspective here fits a little bit of how Giuliani is maybe an unreliable narrator or director. Twists and turns in this drama have definitely benefited from his telling. And so our thanks tonight to the dog who grabbed that camera in his mouth and ran it all over the place this weekend. It's something worth seeing. Now, as for Giuliani, he is claiming collusion is not a crime. This point, of course, first arose last May after Trump fired FBI Director James Comey. News broke within a week that Comey said the president asked him to end the investigation into his recently fired National Security Advisor, Mike Flynn. Boom. Then the DOJ, of course, appointed Bob Mueller special counsel the next day. Trump's colossal mistake, taking the one and only possible action that could enlarge that probe into his White House. As we all know by now, it changed the whole arc of his presidency. It spawned a cottage industry of Trump legal actions and discussion, from former prosecutors explaining this probe into his conduct, we'll have one in a moment, to his allies experimenting on TV with all kinds of defenses, and some are better than others. If you say Trump was a rookie and he didn't know what his campaign was up to, if true, that's a decent legal defense. If you say Trump did collude and that's not a crime, that's not a decent legal defense because it's not true, and it also kind of makes you sound guilty. So here's how that one got started on Fox News.
I mean, look, and I've said it before and I'll say it again, collusion is not a crime. Only in antitrust law. You can collude all you want with a foreign government in an election. There's no such statute.
But what crime?
Right.
Can anybody identify the crime? Collusion, while it's obviously be alarming and highly inappropriate for the Trump campaign, of which there's no evidence, by the way, of colluded with the Russians, it's not a crime.
We'll get to that, the fact check anyway, but let's go through this history. In May and June of last year, then you had Trump allies going back to the claim of collusion's not a crime, and it seemed like a weird defense to start with at the time, rather than just denying it. But then it made more sense when the New York Times would later report, this was last summer, something that many close Trump aides apparently already knew, that there was this Russia-Trump Tower meeting, that Trump's own son took it explicitly after being promised the damaging information on Clinton. And then the Times exposed the actual exchanges that preceded the meeting, including, of course, if it's what you say, I love it. So if you did that, you might need a wider defense than denial. In October came the indictments of those multiple Trump campaign officials. October 30th, the special counsel announcing those indictments against Paul Manafort, who goes on trial tomorrow, plus his deputy, campaign manager Rick Gates. Mueller also announced guilty pleas of foreign policy advisor George Papadopoulos, who admitted to lying about his contacts with who? With Russian nationals who he thought were tied to the Russian government, who had offered him what? Yes, information about the possible release of Hillary Clinton's emails. So following those indictments, we again saw allies of the president, including now, and this is key, the president's own lawyers, picking up the argument like a GoPro camera, collusion's not a crime, and running around with it.
You just had all this conversation about collusion. Remember this, collusion in and of itself, there's no crime of collusion.
That's not just a pundit. That's the president's lawyer, Jay Sekulow, and he would return to that. He'd pick up that bone, if you will, in his mouth and whip it around. Now, following the guilty plea of Mike Flynn a month later, Sekulow said, quote, for something to be a crime, there has to be a statute that you claim is being violated. There's not a statute that refers to criminal collusion. There's no crime of collusion. The president himself jumped in on this and the argument he heard about on TV from Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz, and the president then brought it up in an interview with the New York Times, saying, I watched Dershowitz the other day. He said, number one, there's no collusion. Number two, collusion's not a crime, but even if it was a crime, there was no collusion. Now, that's the combining of the denial with the collusion is not a crime narrative. Now, it maybe went away for a few months. The president was focusing on just the straight-up no collusion point. You see it in all the tweets. And then now it is roaring back because of the Thursday night bombshell that the president's own former lawyer and fixer, Cohen, is claiming, despite all those denials, the president did know about the Russia-Trump Tower meeting in advance. Now, when that report dropped, the allies of the president, you bet, you know what happens next. They picked it up, they whipped it around, and began running with it again.
It's hard to see the point of all of this hysteria. What exactly would the crime here be? It's not illegal to talk to foreigners. Nobody is claiming that any information changed hands, though even if it did, so what?
Look, I don't think that it's bad if campaigns are turning to foreign governments for dirt. It's not collusion. It's not something that's impeachable.
As they say in court, hey, dude, no one cares if you think it's bad. The question is whether it's an illegal conspiracy. Now, this was carried on through the weekend by the president's surrogates on Sunday shows.
So we don't even know if the information that we're being given by that other outlet is even accurate. Now, if it is, and we've discussed this before, collusion is not a crime. And so the fact of the matter is that we're a long way away yet from having anything to talk about here.
And today it got stranger with the president's own lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, going further.
I've been sitting here looking in the federal code trying to find collusion as a crime.
It's not.
Collusion is not a crime. I don't even know if that's a crime, colluding about Russians.
Okay.
You start analyzing the crime. The hacking is the crime. The hacking is the crime.
That certainly is the original
Well, the
crime.
president didn't
Yes.
hack.
Of course not. That's the original
He didn't pay them for hacking.
He didn't pay them for hacking. Can I just point out that Donald Trump famously doesn't pay his own contractors and his own longtime lawyers? I mean, even if his opponents were accusing him of anything, it wouldn't be of paying Vladimir Putin for the hack. But big picture, we are, as all of this voluminous record shows, a long ways from any kind of straight denial, and we're getting closer to people who work for the president right now saying that even an alleged knowing election conspiracy quid pro quo ought to be legal. Mueller, meanwhile, is probing how Trump used the July 26, 2016 speech that we all remember to weirdly address Russia in the second person on the very criminal activity that it's now been indicted for, saying, quote, Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. Indeed, we know this timeline from the new indictment. It was the very same night that Russian agents, quote, for the first time attempted to spearfish email accounts used by Clinton's personal office. Is that just history? Is it just odd timing? Did Mueller just indict foreigners and Paul Manafort and is now maybe getting ready to wrap things up? To be fair, we don't know. They haven't said. But what we're seeing right now, amidst some of this collusion is not a crime hysteria, is the people closest to this, people like Rudy Giuliani and the president himself, they're not acting like Mueller is wrapping this up. They are acting like something is about to get much hotter and like it's somehow, for some reason, important to them to get at least their supporters, at least some people in this nation right now tonight, to believe that crimes are not crimes. I turn now to a former federal prosecutor, Daniel Goldman, who's a U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. He's a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Collusion is not a word that figures importantly into the federal statutes, but the reference to an election conspiracy is the type of crime that is in the statutes. Walk us through what to make of this type of defense.
If you were to sit on television every night and every time you talked about this investigation, you would have to say, let's talk about the investigation into a conspiracy to defraud the United States from impeding the proper functions of the government, people would turn the channel off. Collusion is just shorthand for potentially several crimes that are in the federal code. And so this shift in strategy, when Rudy Giuliani unquestionably knows that, means to me there's something else up. It's just too simplistic and just too incorrect, even for someone like Rudy Giuliani, who has made a number of misleading and incorrect statements over the past couple months. Even for him, it's a clear change in strategy.
What does it suggest to you that he's worried about?
So you mentioned the Michael Cohen piece. I actually think there might be an additional wrinkle to this because, and follow me here for a second, Giuliani introduced the notion of this preceding meeting to that June 9th meeting. That was not out there before. And today on one of his many interviews, he said that one of the people at that meeting was Rick Gates. Rick Gates is the star cooperating witness in the Paul Manafort trial, which is set to begin tomorrow. And before a trial, the government has to provide to the defense every prior statement of any of their witnesses. So now Manafort's attorneys have Rick Gates's prior statements, all of his interviews with Mueller and his team. And what sticks out to me is that Gates was at that meeting. And it would not surprise me, this is pure conjecture, and there may be limitations on whether Manafort's lawyers can disclose this, but it would not surprise me at all if Rudy Giuliani learned from Manafort's lawyers a little bit about what Rick Gates is going to say about collusion. And they're now trying to get out in front of this by not denying that there is collusion, but by saying it's not a crime.
That's a fascinating theory that would explain some of the chain of potential information. But given what Manafort is charged with, why would the Trump Tower meeting come up at all?
It will likely not come up at the trial. But because of the federal rules of evidence and the federal statutes that require the government to disclose all of his prior statements because they can be used for cross-examination to impeach him, Manafort's lawyers will have known about this. So don't expect to hear about this at the trial that's upcoming, but it's something that through potential back channels Rudy Giuliani could learn. And also, Rudy Giuliani would not have been able to speak to Rick Gates. So he would not, when he says and goes on, I said, I've spoken to everybody at those meetings. It is not true that Giuliani himself, at least, has spoken to Rick Gates since Gates cooperated before Giuliani came on the scene.
Right, and it's enough to make your head spin because you're referring to how Rudy Giuliani said, well, there was talk about a pre-meeting, which could make them look bad if they were all geared up and prepping for getting bad stuff on Clinton from the Russians. But then he says, well, maybe there wasn't a pre-meeting anyway. So what's he doing there?
Covering his tracks, because I think he spoke too much. And I think he realized at some point that this is the first anyone had heard of this pre-meeting, and everyone's focused on it now. And for him to give an explanation of, oh, there was a pre-meeting, but the president wasn't there and didn't know about it, again, it's thou doth protest too much. You know, of course the president didn't pay Vladimir Putin for hacking. Of course the president didn't speak to Vladimir Putin on the phone and say, hey, can you interfere in our election on my behalf? I mean, but you don't have to do that.
Yeah, if you don't pay contractors in Atlantic City, you're probably not paying the Kremlin. They're farther away.
And there's no fundamental understanding of a conspiracy which does not require direct contact. You can build evidence of a conspiracy through all sorts of direct or circumstantial evidence.
Right, and Giuliani also knows under campaign laws, even accepting the thing of value from a foreign government is illegal. So that it doesn't require an actual transaction there. As always, Daniel Goldman, we learned from you. Thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.